Just like a quarterback calls the shots on the field, you, as a plan sponsor, are calling the shots in your employee's retirement plan. With that comes a responsibility to build a winning plan, otherwise known as your fiduciary duty. Let's break down your role in the game. So, Sara, how can plan sponsors stay compliant and safe?
Well, really, to answer that question, you have to step back and understand that the way that retirement plan fiduciaries are structured is very faulted. Not to be too judgmental, but in every other aspect, a fiduciary is somebody who is legally and ethically responsible for another party. And they have rigorous training, advanced degrees, they have to do continuing education, the list goes on and on. But here, in very stark contrast, somebody who has expertise in an alternative field is now thrust into a situation where they have to have investment oversight. Who has the tools or skills to do that? They have to be basically an expert in retirement plans, and most of them aren't trained to do that. So in that, if they don't have the expertise and they realize that, then they're required to actually hire an outside person to handle that. But that is not where their responsibility stops. They then have to go on to monitor the person they hired and do due diligence on them. It is a very overwhelming process. But to stay compliant and safe, they really need structure, discipline, and documentation.
So let's have a couple of examples there. Is there anything specifically around those things that you're talking about?
Sure. So when we talk about structure, discipline, and documentation, we are always talking about preventing lawsuits. That is always the biggest fear, but we're also talking about what the DOL and IRS really expects, because it outlines in ERISA that you have all of these things documented. They want to see how you're managing your investments. They want to see how your plan's structured and that you're operating in accordance to all of those things. So again, it really goes back to those three key words: structure, discipline, and documentation. And that doesn't mean you have to document every single word. You want to document how decisions are made. And that is really the key. And that is what everybody's looking for when they come in and look at your plan.
So is there a real situation where plan sponsors are going to find themselves in a situation where they need to defend themselves? Yes.
Litigation is on the rise. We've just made it so it's easy to do. And litigating attorneys have found that this is a place that they can really gain traction. One of the tactics that we are seeing, we just saw it with Swiss Re, is they give a laundry list of different issues the plan's having. So they don't just go in and say fiduciary oversight. There are so many different aspects of the retirement plan. Fiduciary responsibility and fees are still the number one target, but we're adding to that forfeiture and all sorts of other oversight aspects. And we haven't seen how this works out yet in this particular case, but what we're thinking is they're hoping that if they say enough, that it all won't get dismissed at the beginning. They won't have the documentation and the processes to dismiss it at the beginning, and they will be able to move forward with the case.
Sort of that approach. We'll just throw everything against the wall and see if anything sticks.
So with this case, they had excessive record keeping fees. They had imprudent investment decisions, misuse of participant data, which is one of the newer ones, where we saw that actually the record keeper was pulled in because they were cross-selling to the participants. And on both sides, both the record keeper and the plan sponsor, they had breach of fiduciary duty. So again, it was one of the longest lists that we've seen, and it'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
Yeah, and I think I'll come back to that on fees a little bit later, but I know we have a checklist that we use with our clients. Talk a little bit about that. What does a checklist look like for a plan sponsor who's trying to get ahead of some of these things?
Sure. Well, again, it all comes back to that structure, because the structure is going to be really that roadmap, how everything is set up. So we do work with our clients to make sure that our advisory agreement, make sure we stay on the same side of the table if something does come up. We also make sure that there's an outline for their investments, and the same goes on their administrative side, that they have a clear understanding of how their plan is written. Because if you don't understand how it's set up, then how can you make sure that as we go through the processes that we do exactly what we say we're going to do? In addition to that, it really takes the pressure off the fiduciaries if it's all set up correctly and they have people that come in and really handle it for them. we tell our clients our goal is to make their lives easier. This is a hard process that puts a lot of responsibility on them, and they are actually personally liable. So we want to come in and do everything we can. We're all in the boat together, but we're going to be rowing really hard. So that's kind of how we structure it.
Yeah, and I think that's why active due diligence and management is every plan sponsor's first line of defense, right?
Absolutely.
There's all of these threats kind of out there. It's not just sponsor a plan and off you go, right?
Right.
It's being aware and having that active management. SWBC is a fully independent firm, and I think it's important to have that specialist at your side that doesn't have a vested interest in anything except acting in the best interest of that plan sponsor.
Yeah, we do take the conflicts of interest seriously. I mean, not even letting somebody buy us a cup of coffee. Something that I think is important and that we can really stand behind.
For sure.
So Brad, let's change topics just a little bit. What are you seeing are some of the must-know management tips for avoiding some of these litigation and some of these newer situations like forfeiture accounts?
Yeah. So with forfeiture accounts, first of all, forfeitures are you've made an employer contribution to a plan, then an employee leaves before they're fully vested. Those funds come back to the plan. So I'd say the top three things are, number one, knowing what are you legally able to use those funds for. There's very specific guidelines that ERISA says what you're allowed to use those for. Second piece is knowing very clearly what are you in fact using them for. There's with a lot of different ways you can use them, whether it's paying for plan fees or reducing your employer contributions, whatever you're using them for. Just having that real confidence of what you specifically are doing with them. But then the last piece, and this is where the litigation has come in, is what does your plan document say you're going to do with those funds?
So different plans. So if you were maybe an HR professional at one group and switched to another, your rules now might have changed.
Right, because just because the law says you can use it to offset plan expenses doesn't mean your plan document says that that's the first thing that you're going to do with those. So that's where the litigation came from. It said, all right, we're going to use it first to reduce our employer contribution, and if there was any left over, we would use it to reduce expenses. But that's not what they were doing. So if they weren't specifically, even though they're using the forfeitures in a legally permissible way, if that's not what your plan document says, as far as the hierarchy of how you're going to use it, that's where they got themselves in trouble.
Yeah, and I think some of these situations too, where they're really wanting that best practices of using it within 12 months. And I know that a lot of our clients have a lot of rehires. So those accounts bump up very quickly. So having a strategic plan of when to use them could really help, I would think, offset that.
No doubt.
So what are some red flags really that have been the target of litigation, some additional ones?
So red flags is such a broad term, right? Anything can be a red flag. When you're out there and you research 5,500 forms, those tax forms that every retirement plan has to file, and they're public documents, you can go and you can search through databases. And I've had some of our clients come to us, I know you've had the same, Sara, where they say, oh my gosh, we have 6 red flags. We have 8 red flags according to this database. And I said, well, one of them is that you don't have target date funds. Or, for any plan, they pull out all of these things that could be a red flag. But for any one given plan sponsor, there might be a very specific reason why they don't have that specific thing. A red flag, I don't have auto enrollment. And so a client that I have that doesn't have automatic enrollment, they don't have it because they have a very high turnover rate and they don't want to have to deal with all those small balances and getting in there and then having them returned. And so they had a very specific reason for not using it. So red flags aren't necessarily a bad thing, but certainly, there are red flags that are very concerning. And I think where we want to talk about is the ones that are concerning, and it comes down to lack of process. If a plan sponsor doesn't have a reason for getting to where they are, that's the problem. It's not necessarily about where you ended up, but it's how you got there that really makes the biggest impact on the plan and the biggest ultimate defense, if you find yourself in a situation where you're getting challenged. Another thing too is we've seen a lot of our clients getting these excessive fee questionnaires when they're re-upping their insurance, and they're not sure necessarily how to fill it out. I had one client sort of offhandedly send it to me and say, "Hey, could you help me with some of these answers? I've spent so many hours on it and I'm struggling with it." And I said, "Yeah, I'll fill out the whole thing for you." And we have all the information in the process for that client to fill out all the when's the last time you benchmarked, what are your fees, when did you last have a reduction, what's your process for selecting investments. They're very specific on a lot of different topics. And the client said, "Oh my gosh, I actually think I misstated some of the things in my draft." So it's making sure that you're not creating red flags inadvertently as you're trying to do the right thing, even for your plan.
Yeah, those questionnaires have really gone from maybe 1 or 2 questions to sometimes 15 questions now. That is a direct result of the litigation because insurance companies aren't wanting to pay out. So they want to make sure all of these different plans that they're defending really have that in place. And we've now, I think we help almost all of our clients now with these, at least the ones that get it. I'm sure there's more to come as well. So with that, what do you think is the next wave of legal challenges that we're going to see?
I'd say it's not real easy to predict where your next wave is going to be, right? We've seen everything from excessive fees to forfeitures to socially responsible investments to index versus active target dates. There's all kinds of litigation out there. So I don't know that anyone has the crystal ball and says we know what the next round of litigation is going to be. I maybe wouldn't have predicted that forfeitures were going to show up on anyone's radar. So I think as we look at existing cases, Tussey versus ABB, that was years ago. I think it's a case that a lot of people are familiar with. It was an excessive fee case, and there was almost $22 million awarded in damages. Now, obviously a very big plan to have those kind of damages. But then we've actually seen more recently a case, White versus Chevron, which was the opposite. They got challenged, but it got dismissed because they had all the right documentation, right? They had the investment policy statement. They had their meeting minutes. They had all of the meetings that have happened. They just have a very good roadmap, that structure, discipline, and documentation that we talk about so much, and they were able to get their case dismissed. So I think probably the biggest defense and is not trying to get out there and predict, where the next challenge is going to be. It's being proactive, right? It's making sure that you're trying to get ahead of it as a plan sponsor and be proactive so that you're not just sitting back waiting for the challenge and then trying to figure out how you're going to defend it, right? You want to try and get that process down, do everything you can to make sure that you're going to have a process in place if you ever get challenged down the road. And frankly, get help so that you can get back to work. You talked about the fiduciary and the idea that, it's sort of a flawed system in our industry because you put people in these roles with these very high fiduciary expectations that don't have the expertise and don't have the experience to really fulfill those roles. And so it's get help. If you can't do it yourself, hire someone that can help you with it.
You said it, we say it all the time. We say it with our clients, structure, discipline, and documentation. Really kind of walk us through the documentation play and what all needs to be documented.
Everything, right? So I think...
so they should use that court stenographer to take minutes?
Yeah. So I think, you have to be reasonable with it, right? And use common sense as you go through it. But I think, we talk a lot about the idea that if you didn't document it, it didn't happen, right? So everyone hates doing meeting minutes. We do minutes for our clients. I can't say it's my favorite thing that we do, but it's one of the most important.
Maybe the least favorite thing.
Yeah. But it's one of the most important things that we do, right? Because even as you look back at your last quarter, 3 months have happened since maybe we had our last meeting, and it helps refresh everybody. Where did we end up on these topics? What were the action points? It's making sure that you document it so that not only do you document it in case you get challenged, but it just helps everybody continue things forward and make sure that it doesn't just get lost in the mix. Because, we've had meetings, right, where everybody's excited. You walk out of that meeting and then you show back up 3 months later and everybody just got back to work, right? And started doing their daily jobs. And so we want to make sure we're always pushing all of our things forward and connecting those minutes with action points and making sure that we're documenting everything because, it comes down to it. If it's not documented, it's not going to happen.
Oh, and those clients are usually the best to be 338 so that we can just keep moving forward for them. So with that, in that level of documentation, one of the things I know we've seen with our clients is they get these reports. We try to take them through and highlight any of the kind of blinking warning lights within our report, whether it's a watch list or replace. And the record keepers, we really ask them to do the same. But, that's something I think plan sponsors need to know too. We talk about red flags, but you also don't want to have a red flag buried in one of your reports that you then have in your compliance file that you aren't taking action on, right?
Yeah. And I think, the biggest mistake that plan sponsors make is overconfidence. It really comes just down to overconfidence. You and I have both heard so many times, oh no, we're good. Or, we've got that covered. Or, even, well, we haven't really had any complaints. So, I think we're going to just, pass. And overconfidence can really, get a plan sponsor in trouble. Now, we're not saying every plan sponsor out there has, huge issues, or that every plan sponsor is not acting in their employees' best interest or doesn't have the expertise. But it's really along the lines of, checking yourself and making sure that you're not in that overconfidence boat. And in the example you provided, the idea of reporting versus advice. So you get these reports and one fund has a skull and crossbones next to it. And then this other fund has sunshine and rainbows. And it's like any reasonable person looking at that would say, all right, well, I'm going to replace skull and crossbones with, sunshine and rainbows. But that's not advice.
You're making an assumption?
Yes, right. That's an assumption, right? So it's the idea that it's not advice. Advice is what you need in order for someone to be a fiduciary and someone to protect you. But the other is just reporting. And reporting, there is no liability on the person that provided you that reporting. And so you're not protected as a fiduciary. So it's that overconfidence and sometimes just misunderstanding in what you're even being provided.
Can you give us some specific cases maybe where documentation came into play?
So we've seen it more lately, right? So 3 cases: Prime Healthcare, B. Braun, and Milliman. So all 3 of these were cases that were successfully defended and really dismissed because they had all the building blocks in place, right? They had the right roadmap, the right process. And so they had the right playbook that got them to a place where when they were challenged, they were able to successfully defend it. And what's even been even more interesting, I think, about these isn't just that they were able to get it dismissed or be defended. It's that the courts are starting to take this position that when you're bringing up these experts, the litigators and those that are challenging these retirement plans, bring up specialists and put them on the stand, the courts are actually dismissing them as specialists, but because they're coming there from an outcomes-based perspective. So you sit up there on the stand and you testify and you say that they didn't make the right choice in the end, and that's an outcome, right? You don't have to have the best fund. You don't have to have the lowest fees, and you don't have to have the best outcome. You just have to have a reasonable process for how you get there. And so the courts are really starting to press that issue to say it is so much more about the process than it is about the outcome. Now, we want to have a good process and we want to have good outcomes. I don't want to say that we're not looking for good outcomes.
But we're not expecting them to be fortune tellers. We're already asking them to be fiduciaries, right?
That's right. And you asked earlier, where is litigation going to go? And I don't have the crystal ball. I have no idea where the next wave of litigation is going to come from. So just like you don't know what Fund A is going to be doing 5 years from now.
Right.
So the important part, and the courts are starting to notice this, and really going against experts and saying, you're coming at it from a results-based perspective. We want a process-based. So I think, we talked about structure, discipline, and documentation. That's our playbook for how we get our sponsors to where they need to be.